You don't give a shit about this show anymore, let's be honest. It's like bands that hate each other that have to get on stage every night and play for the audience. We don't even like each other, dude.
That's not true. I like Mike. George,
he's about to
You don't say.
Impaulsive, hosted by Logan Paul, Mike Majlak, and George Janko, has been a fan favorite for years, but recent events have left fans questioning the show's future. George's absence from the podcast, as well as cryptic tweets and unfollowing Logan and Mike, have led many to believe that there may be trouble in paradise. George even has been removed from the podcast YouTube banner and profile picture. Is George leaving Impaulsive to focus on his own podcast? Has Jeff Wittek replaced George? Did George get fired? Stick around to find out. When it comes to George Janko on Impaulsive, lately George barely speaks. He can be seen waiting for the perfect opportunity to land a joke. However, when he does finally speak up, it can feel out of place, as he's been quiet for so long. This can be frustrating for his co-host, as Shaquille O'Neal can be heard saying,
Gotta say something.
Listen, man, I read the Bible a lot when they talk about David and Goliath. I've never seen a giant, and so like I'm literally just, I'm a little taken.
You've been sitting over here for 30 minutes, and that's all you can freaking say? Fucking kidding me.
Now he's not gonna say
That's the question. Jeez.
I didn't.
in the last few months where George was still around, these type of comments can be seen more and more. A main factor that creates this dynamic is the lack of respect Logan shows George compared to his treatment of Mike. When George speaks, Logan often cuts him off to interject his own thoughts first, as can be heard in the exchange, "George, I just want to say, well, yeah." Then Logan interrupts him again, saying, "George, can you just not die on this hill? Just let the men talk, okay?" The lack of engagement from other guests makes it difficult for George to participate, and the podcast setup is not conducive to his involvement as well. A comparison to similar podcast, Flagrant by Andrew Schultz, demonstrates how a balanced dynamic can be achieved with multiple hosts. Schultz sits on one side of the guest, and the two other supporting hosts sit on the other side, allowing them to gain attention through their numbers advantage. Impaulsive could benefit from a similar setup, with Logan on one side and Mike and George on the other. This would alleviate the pressure on George to constantly be funny and help to create a more balanced conversation, especially because this isn't the first time the third co-host has left. How the podcast is set up is probably a big factor in this leaving the podcast pattern. The situation hit a new low during an episode in November 2022 with stand-up comedian Bobby Lee. The podcast started off well, but as it went on, Bobby slowly turned away from George more and more. About an hour in, Mike acknowledged this and passed the conversation over to George, acknowledging that his seat was a tough one to sit in if he wanted to ask questions. Unfortunately, this is where George made a mistake that set the wheels in motion for what followed. George shared that the 2 past years of his life had been the hardest. He gained 40 pounds and had been struggling with depression. He noted that if he weren't Christian, he might have been suicidal. This seemed like an opportunity for Logan and Bobby to show some empathy and support for George. However, Bobby instead responded, "Oh, okay, so you're like, I'm Christian, but I still want to die?" The insensitive remark from Bobby caused Logan to laugh, which only made the situation worse. George tried to laugh it off as well, but it was clear he was hurt. Later in the podcast, Bobby made a few more insensitive comments that seemed to be directed at George, such as joking that George would have to leave the podcast if he didn't do a good job. In this moment, George shared something personal on a podcast episode, hoping for support from his co-host. However, Bobby, the comedian famous for his biting jokes, took advantage of George's vulnerability to tear him down. George was left feeling defeated and unheard as Bobby steamrolled the conversation. George tried to salvage the situation with some humor of his own, but it fell flat with the others. Although George's openness and vulnerability were commendable, his choice of topic and audience was not appropriate for a comedic podcast. While it's understandable that George wanted to share his personal struggles, discussing them with a comedian who uses trauma for brutal humor was not the best choice. George seemed to become upset and defensive when the conversation became too personal, and this caused an uncomfortable dynamic on the show. It was interesting to observe how Mike and Logan handled George's emotional outpouring on the podcast. Mike displayed empathy towards George and tried to assist him, while Logan made fun of him. One could argue that Logan's job was to keep the podcast moving and take care of his guests, but George's feelings were not considered. Although this argument held true for this episode, Logan's lack of empathy became apparent in subsequent episodes. The episode sparked a significant controversy, with some people sympathizing with George while others considered his behavior unprofessional. In a later episode, George apologized for his actions but failed to apologize directly to Bobby, which disappointed him. During the same episode, George confessed to feeling like he was not performing well on the podcast anymore. The Impaulsive crew has acknowledged that the audience's comments reflect their sentiments, and lately there have been a noticeable shift in how viewers perceive George and Mike. Previously, George was the most beloved cast member, known for his ability to balance humor and sincerity while treating guests with kindness and respect. Mike, on the other hand, was often criticized for interrupting guests and focusing too much on his past drug use. However, recent comments show a shift in perception, with some viewers finding George's approach too serious and lacking in humor, while others appreciate Mike's candidness and comedic timing. One reason for Mike's popularity is that he has more common ground with the guests they have on the show. Additionally, he's good at steering the conversation and choosing interesting topics to talk about. Viewers have also noticed how much Mike looks out for George on the show, which shows a caring side to him that wasn't present before. All of these changes have been great for Mike, but not so good for George. George is more sensitive than Mike and is not as well equipped to handle negative feedback. If he continues to struggle, he may fall out of favor with more and more viewers. 5 episodes after the Bobby Lee incident, the next controversy took place. Logan was seen really tired and wasn't at his brightest. George, on the other hand, after experiencing so much negative feedback, was trying hard to get back in the game. But when the topic of Christianity came around, George confronted Logan on some of his statements around the religion. This led to insensitive comments from Logan, which again made the internet go crazy about the podcast. With now even more negative feedback coming in, even more tension started to brew between Logan and George. Despite George's dedication to the show, some fans are calling for his removal, suggesting the podcast may be better off without him. After the stack of controversies and drama surrounding the podcast, to top it all off, George started his own podcast with the first episode titled "Why George Isn't on Impaulsive." He makes jokes about having left the podcast, but admitted to using the title to clickbait viewers for his first episode. He's been putting out content consistently and is growing his podcast smoothly, but he dropped so many episodes that it really looks like he's now running his own show. But this didn't go unnoticed by Logan and his team. Without addressing the situation, Logan removed George from the YouTube banner and profile pictures. Some noticed and are getting concerned. As time goes on, the audience is left questioning where George went. Will he even come back? George hasn't been seen on the podcast for almost 2 months.
And I'm just doing this for a couple weeks so then I could leave and clickbait that why I left Impaulsive.
That's good. It's a good strategy.
That'll crush.
It's been done. It's been done many times, and it works.
While Jeff Wittek, a recent friend of the Impaulsive crew, has been around more and more, and even was recently announced as the new third co-host. Whether this is a joke, we can't tell yet. When it comes to Jeff, he jokes all the time, which makes it hard to know for sure if this shift on the podcast is reality. There seems to be a trend going when it comes to third co-host on Impaulsive. Throughout the years, 3 of them have now left the podcast, while Mike and Logan remain as the main stars of the show.
Can I recognize something right
I'm
off the
taking
bat?
this show down to hell with me.